Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to one of the first talks of the morning. I hope everyone slept well. So today we're lucky enough to have Anders Sandberg come present to us today. Anders Sandberg's research centers on estimating the capabilities and underlying science of future technologies, methods of reasoning about long-term futures, existential and global catastrophic risk, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, SETI, as well as societal and ethical issues surrounding human enhancement. Topics of particular interest include management of systemic risk, reasoning under uncertainty, enhancement of cognition, neuroethics, and public policy. He has worked on this within the EU, Project Enhance, where he was also responsible for public outreach and online presence, and the ERC Unpredict project. Besides scientific publications in neuroscience, ethics, and future studies, he's also participated in the public debate about human enhancement, existential risk, and SETI internationally. Please welcome Anders on to stage.
Thank you so much for that opening. So, as you can tell, I'm one of those people who can't keep to one topic. I have been driving quite a lot of professors into early gray hairs because I'm not researching what I'm supposed to be working on. This is actually what my director would like me to work on, perhaps, but it's coming from quite a lot of different directions. So this is going to be a talk which is fundamental about ethics, but of course I'm also getting into the history of ideas, questions about evolution, questions about long-range planning, and of course spaceflight and other cool things. So, what is by the way, I should also mention Asher Sorrell has contributed quite a lot. This talk is to a big chunk based on a paper we're writing right now, although I'm adding other weird quirks because I'm also writing about some even more extravagant stuff. But to get started, we have this interesting question: are we alone in the universe? And this is a question that's surprisingly modern. Many people would say today, that's kind of an obvious, important question. But to a lot of people across history, the answer was self-evident. Of course we're not alone. Of course, every place where there can be people, there are going to be people and animals and plants. Otherwise, it would be weird. Anaxagoras, one of the pre-Socratic Greek philosophers, famously suggested that actually there are little seeds of life floating around everywhere in the universe, and sometimes they fall down on Earth, so if there isn't life in some place, those life seeds will blossom. This is slightly related to the idea that actually life spontaneously just generates when the conditions are right, which was a fairly popular idea up until Louis Pasteur actually demonstrated that no, life only comes from other life. But of course, Anaxagoras and his followers would say, yeah, but don't worry, there's life everywhere, anywhere. So why worry? Indeed, when you get over to the early modern era and the Enlightenment, you find Immanuel Kant doing a surprisingly modern argument in his writings where he talks about the importance of making bets about your beliefs. He pointed out that many debates can be improved if you bet a few guineas on it, because suddenly, when there's money at stake, many people become much more epistemically careful. 50 pages later in the same book, he says, I'm willing to bet anything I own that, of course, there are intelligent beings on other heavenly bodies. That is interesting. I wonder whether he was seriously making that bet or just claiming it, kind of undercutting a little bit what he was saying 50 pages earlier. But this view was very, very common, up until it suddenly ran into the astronomy and the space programs of the 20th century. At the start of the century, the idea of having Martians was not too crazy. After the Viking probes landed in the 70s, yeah, there was nothing there, or at least not anything that we could obviously notice. And indeed, we understood the conditions of other planets in the solar system to make the chances of having Martians or Venusians or Jupiterians look exceedingly slim. Suddenly, the universe looked much emptier. And that, as Thomas Moynihan in his excellent book on the history of existential risk pointed out, led to this re-evaluation of our place in the universe, we might be the only ones, we might be the only intelligent beings. Indeed, this might be the only planet with life on it, which is a frightening prospect, because that means we're kind of in charge of this small flickering green flame of complexity in an otherwise dead and empty universe. Oh, we might actually have to do something about this. And that, of course, leads both to thinking about existential risk, which is perhaps one of the most important impacts of this, but also the question, maybe we should start spreading that little green flame across the universe. This idea is actually a little bit older than this realization that the cosmos is totally empty. So Nikolai Fyodorov and the other Russian cosmists already had this idea that we ought to spread across the universe. God literally commands us to do it. So original Russian cosmist was very much rooted in his view, slightly heterodox view of Christianity. And his student, Nikolai Tsiolkovsky, the father of spaceflight, then popularized many of these views, maybe with a somewhat reduced religious bent and more practical bent in thinking about how do you make rockets, how do you make space habitat. We are going to need spacesuits. But in his writings, besides famous quotes like Earth is the cradle of humanity, but one cannot remain in the cradle forever, there is this idea that, yes, we have a duty to go out into the universe and spread Earth life. There are some interesting, creepy passages where he's discussing what to do about other alien life and which kind of life has the best rights, etc. But the general idea is, of course, we ought to be going out there. And indeed, when you then combine that with this view that actually the universe looks pretty dead, and if you think that life has some form of value in itself, I'm going to return to that point, then of course you can get to very interesting philosophical points. So Marshall Savage, in his book, The Millennial Project, which literally got a green galaxy on the cover, says, if we deny our awesome challenge, turn our backs on the living universe and forsake our cosmic destiny, we will commit a crime of unutterable magnitude. Mankind alone has the power to carry out this fundamental change in the universe. Our failure would lead to consequences unthinkable. This is perhaps the first and only chance the universe will ever have to awaken from its long night and live. We are the caretakers of this delicate spark of life. To let it flicker and die through ignorance, neglect, or lack of imagination is a horror too great to contemplate. Yeah, that's a really magnificent quote. Of course, somebody in the ethics part of philosophy department immediately will start nitpicking on it. But there is a wonderful force there, and many people felt that. We have a good reason to go out there and spread life. And you could, of course, say, okay, the important part is humanity. We are going to spread there, but we need food. We want to have gardens. We would like to see an ecosystem. So even if you don't care about nature, if we are going there, we're going to spread life. Or you could say life itself is valuable. Even if no human ever sets a foot on a planet, it's better if that planet is green. So a lot of the more traditional parts of discussion about space have been dealing with traditional space settlement and things like terraforming. And one can think about the conversion of an unliving planet into a planet that can host Earth life in various ways. So the kind of cliche target, probably because it's the only somewhat realistic target in a solar system, is Mars. And people have spent a fair bit of effort thinking about how to do it. And the interesting part here to me seems to be that you can do it by gentle nudges. Carl Sagan and others said we should be putting dark dust on the polar caps to make the carbon dioxide evaporate, getting a thicker atmosphere that would allow more water to exist there. We put up a bit of solar reflectors, and then hopefully you can reach a tipping point where you jump over to a warmer, wetter climate, where your hydrological cycles start and you get greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The problem is there is probably not enough volatiles on Mars to do this. So maybe you need to import them. Maybe you actually need to pick apart the Saturnus moon Enceladus, as Freeman Dyson suggested, transport the parts of the moon using solar cells and bombard Mars with that to really add an ocean. And once you start thinking big, okay, big arrays of reflectors, maybe we should use factories to make super greenhouse gases. Actually, why don't we use nanomachines to essentially pick apart the planet and put it back together into an Earth? You have a spectrum going from a very gentle nudge over to literally remodeling a planet. And most people tend to lean towards the idea that, oh, a gentle nudge, really. Partially because it seems to be the conservative thing to do. After all, this is very advanced technology. We're talking about at the other end of the spectrum. We don't know how close we are, and it seems to be the reasonable thing. And there is probably also this idea that, yeah, maybe this is respecting the planet better. It's a very interesting the discussion that shows up here, because this is where space ethics first rears its head. Wait a minute, you're talking about transforming a planet. What about Earth? What about the rights of Mars? What kind of rights does a planet have? So we get an interesting discourse where people have been arguing about the ethics of doing terraforming. A fair number of ethicists have had this intuition, but this sounds rather bad. Picking apart the planet and turning it into Earth, that's already weird. But even putting life on Mars, do we have a right to do that? Now, I would argue that many of these papers don't have a very great ethics argument, but there is something interesting going on. Just as some people say that life itself has an intrinsic value, you could argue, perhaps, that even unliving environments have an intrinsic value. So there is some discussion about the shaped complexity of Mars. There are beautiful canyons and sand dunes, and if we had some cactuses growing there, would that make things better, or would that just impair the value that exists in these natural sand dunes? The problem with that argument is, of course, that there is another form of shaped complexity consisting of Elon Musk showing up and building Muskville using a complicated economic infrastructure developed from evolution on planet Earth. That's also shaped complexity just as much as a sand dune. So there is an interesting problem how to make this fly ethically and philosophically. There is also an interesting question what kind of world we're talking about. So on one hand, Stanislaw Lem in Solaris, he has a character explain that, well, we humans say that we want to go out into space and explore it, but actually what we want is to turn it to home. We wanted to turn it exactly like at home. And Lem, as an author, is very critical of this. It's very clear that he doesn't approve of this view, but he thinks that this is what humans are going to do. We're going to pave over everything out there and turn it into something similar. Then you have the Star Trek view. To boldly go where no man has gone before and seek out strange new life and strange civilizations. And that part is allowing yourself to be changed, learning something from the alien. Maybe changing it in return, but allowing yourself to be changed. And then you have Heinlein's view that basically is, yeah, we're going to do stuff. Some of it is going to be stupid. Some of it is going to be horribly immoral. When are we going to find out what was stupid and immoral? Well, at the end of time, basically. It's still going to happen, and we're not going to be stopped just by some Aunt Nelly, as he put it, sitting at home, wringing their hands about ethics and politics. Now, this debate is kind of interesting, but it's also relatively far away from something we can do today. So we have plenty of time to be Aunt Nellies about it. But we have another form of intervention that is much more likely to happen much sooner. And that's directed panspermia. So Anaxagoras' panspermia hypothesis, that there are these seeds, the sperms everywhere, that was an explanation of life on Earth. And for a long time, people were kind of throwing it around as a loose idea. Svante Arrhenius, the Swedish chemist and scientist, he actually proposed as a proper scientific theory and in a book around 1900, where he was proposing that actually bacterial spores can probably be lofted away by the solar wind. We should actually expect this to happen. And it's been a somewhat controversial view in the astrobiology community whether this is actually happening or not. There is also a philosophical question whether this is a good explanation of life on Earth. But directed panspermia is the idea that if it's not happening naturally, we can do it anyway. We could loft bacterial spores on the solar wind. We could put them on a payload and try to launch them towards nearby solar systems. This idea first shows up in the writings of Olaf Stapledon, but I think he actually got it from his friend, the biologist Haldane, who wrote about it a bit later himself. And then it has been popularized by other people. And in parts of the space movement, who still got this very strong cosmist idea that we have this kind of duty to spread life, this is, of course, a big deal. So the idea is that if the universe is not already green, we can green it, even if we are unlikely to ourselves be able to go to these stars. Now, how would you go about doing it? The original paper by Mautner and I forgot his other name, they were talking about solar sails. So instead of just throwing spores into space and hoping for the best, you actually need to protect them. There is quite a bit of radiation in space. That's not very good, even if you are a bacterial spore. We know that under some protection, bacterial spores can survive in space for years. And if you actually add a lot more protection, it looks likely that you can extend that much, much more. So the idea would be put up a solar sail, have a small payload, have it drift over to another solar system. This might also be improved if you can shine a laser on that sail, like the project Breakthrough Starshot, the Breakthrough Starshot project that is aiming at actually sending these small probes to nearby stars over the next few decades and actually arriving within a few decades. That would definitely be enough if you put bacterial spores and they're not fried by high temperatures on the sail to be able to get there. Another idea I've seen is that you inoculate interstellar comets. So they move around between solar systems, occasionally they hit planets or break apart, and this way you could have bacterial spores protected by being inside a comet, drifting around the universe. There are interesting questions like radiation tolerance, but you can breed bacteria to be very radiation tolerant. There are questions like how you encapsulate it well. I have a feeling that maybe a few millimeters of clay might be good. So you might want to send a little payload, but when you get into the life zone of a star, thermal expansion opens it up and little clay pellets fall out. That would then hopefully survive a re-entry into the atmosphere, and if there is water, they dissolve, and there go the bacteria. Yay! Now, the interesting insight here is that the individual probability of success for any given spore is very low, but you can send out a lot. The idea is to send it out and have it very cheap, because it's small. It's not like you need to send a lot of brave astronauts. It could be rather effective because you can multiply the likelihood by having many attempts. And of course, it's also potentially irreversible. Once those bacterial spores are going there, it's going to be hard to stop them. And this, of course, leads to the interesting value question. So there are different views here. So on one side, we have a panbiotic ethics. That is more life, more ethical value. Life has a value on its own, and it's additive in some sense. So we should be doing directed panspermia because that maximizes the abundance of life in the universe. And that is kind of a useful approach, especially if you think in an additive way. In that case, you might also get an astronomical waste argument. So we can reach about, if we can at most travel at a third of light speed, then we can reach about 4.95 billion light years away. That's that means that we're literally getting billions of galaxies, each of them with maybe 300 billion planets. And every year we wait, some of the galaxies become unreachable because of the expansion of the universe. So that means that we might lose about 300, according to this calculation at least, 300 million potential habitable planets. 300 million Earths. They would fill the sky if they were in the solar system. It would be a rather crowded sky. It's an enormous amount of biomass, an enormous amount of biosphere getting lost every year. We're waiting. So if you're taking this stance, of course, you feel like you need to rush to the launch pad and launch stuff immediately. Now, how you justify that is, of course, interesting. So Mautner and the others, they argue that living systems tend towards survival and self-propagation. That's their nature. That's what they're kind of for. So hence, the survival and propagation is the purpose of life. As humans, as living beings, we have this purpose too. We are part of having this duty to spread life. At this point, the philosophers in the room will go, wait a minute, Hume said something about is and ought being separate. Basically, this is very enthusiastic space scientists doing ethics slightly badly. Trying to get that purpose straight from the nature of life doesn't necessarily follow. But I think you could probably salvage a version of that argument. It doesn't sound too weird. But you can justify it in other ways too. Another one is biocentrism, claiming that actually life has value. And it's also not just individual organisms, but ecosystems. And that means that you need to work on conservation ecology. Biocentrism is much more popular, of course, in environmental ethics, because it usually tells us humans stop destroying the biosphere. It has value, regardless of what value it has to you. But if you take that seriously, it seems still that maybe we should be adding more biospheres. Normal biocentrists will say, not really. It's more important to conserve existing value than trying to create extra value. There is an interesting disparity here. And in fact, a lot of conservation ethics is actually quite conservative. However, we do have a problem with existential risk. If we go extinct, it's probably not going to be a little mild thing that we just gently go into the night, but probably humanity turns into an expanding ball of paper clips that wipes out the biosphere too. If humanity flubs it, it might be very bad for the biosphere. And in the long run, of course, the biosphere is doomed anyway when the sun starts becoming a red giant. And if you take a biocentrist view, you might still say, we need to save the biosphere from that. So in that perspective, you might still want to do panspermia simply to keep the long history of Earth life going onwards. That still has value, even if you don't think it's kind of important that there is a lot of different planets that have it. Now, this sounds like we have a lot of nice arguments in favor of rushing to the launch pad and sending out those spores, but there are others, including my co-author, who are rather concerned that this is a really bad idea. And they are coming, of course, from a welfarist perspective, that all and only well-being has ethical value. Obviously, there is a lot of other ethical views, but it's kind of nice to put welfarism versus the panbiotic people. They're kind of ends of the spectrum and make the debate a bit clearer. So here this idea is that, well, sentience is a precondition for well-being. And if we do panspermia, we are going to end up with sentient beings across the universe. And a lot of them are going to have really bad lives. Now, why should we expect sentient beings on average to have a lot of bad lives? Well, evolution doesn't care about whether you're happy or not. Happiness or suffering is just a tool from evolution's perspective. It blunders around and figures out ways of making organisms survive and thrive. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that pain is a very good motivator. And from evolution's perspective, the only thing that matters is that you produce a lot of offspring. And in that case, of course, if you have a horrible life, but your genes get transmitted, that's great from an evolutionary perspective, and you get more organisms like that, compared to the happy ones that have fewer offspring. Now, you can use different strategies here. In biology, we speak about R and K strategies. K strategies is what we humans and many other bigger animals do. We have few offsprings that we care quite a lot for, and the probability of them surviving to adulthood is decent. The R strategy is more fish spawning. Have 1 million eggs and 1 million larvae, and all but 1 or 2 of them do get eaten or parasitized or something else. The end result of that is, of course, a tremendous amount of death. Quite a lot of the organisms that are using these strategies, individuals are disposable, which usually means they do get disposed and predated on and parasitized. Which means that given that evolution also produced these motivational systems of pleasure and pain, means that there is a lot of pain. So in this case, we might end up with a situation by adding biospheres, we get a lot more pain. Now, you could still be an optimist like me. Well, maybe pain and pleasure, we can put them on the same scale, and there is actually, on average, a positive scale. At this point, the more gloomy philosopher in the room will say, how do you know you're going to be on the plus side here? Indeed, I can show this pile of philosophy books where people arguing that actually life is pain and actually it's a net negative. Benatar and the other antinatalists, they would argue that actually if we just got out of our illusions, we should realize that we shouldn't want to live on and we should stop being alive. Schopenhauer famously suggested that once we understand that and give up our will to live and just lie down to die, it's not just we who are going to benefit. But since reality itself is held up by our will, once that disappears, the suffering of the animals will go away too. That's what you get when you get antinatalism and idealism combined. You don't necessarily have to go that far, of course. There is an interesting issue about moral priorities. We generally tend to say that suffering has a priority, and that means that even if not all of the alien biosphere is suffering, it's enough that there is bad suffering in some parts of it, that it might make it a net bad to create that biosphere. Now, there are many other theories of suffering, and I don't have the time to get into that very well. I'm very fond of Thomas Metzinger's model of suffering, which requires a fairly advanced brain to work. I'm hoping that's true, because otherwise we would have a real problem on how to help the poor ants on this planet. But even if you buy the more elaborate model, which requires not just sentience, but the ability to think about your relationship to other entities, etc., probably a fair number of mammals are capable of suffering. And if you have a suffering priority ethics, this is still a big problem. So from this perspective, we should definitely not be doing panspermia, because we might increase the total amount of suffering in the universe tremendously. Okay, so what should we do? One of the interesting things here is that there have already been a few illicit payloads going to space. Some of them very cute, like this little monument, which is currently exhibited on the moon. It's not very far away. You can go there on a weekend if you have the right equipment. So this was, left illicitly by some NASA astronauts, by the astronaut David R. Scott and James B. Irwin during Apollo 15. There is also a little art exhibit, including a dick pic due to Andy Warhol, that was smuggled up there. And famously, there was a recent moon probe that crashed, that did not just have a Wikipedia inscribed on a sapphire disk, but also some tardigrades in epoxy. And they were added without approval. There have also been unapproved satellite launches. So the possibility of somebody actually launching stuff into space without approval is non-zero. And this is an interesting problem, because it seems like we have a pretty big disagreement. There is an opportunity cost of waiting if you're a Pan Bio follower. You're losing galaxies every year. But on the other hand, we also have a very strong reason to say that if suffering matters, we might actually have a very strong reason to hold off. We also have normative disagreement. So it's pretty clear that we need to work a bit harder. It's probably not much of a cost right now to slow things down and try to avoid doing this, not do anything irreversible, especially because you can think of it as a unilateralist curse situation. This is a situation where it's enough that one member of a group does something for the consequences to ensue. It might be spoiling a movie or introducing a new species in an environment. It's enough that one person does this for the consequences to happen for everybody. And even if everybody is well-meaning and altruistic and trying to do the right thing, and are now individually evaluating whether it's a good or a bad thing to do, somebody is likely to be that guy just because of a misstep in their calculation or estimation. The larger the group is, the more likely it is that somebody's going to do it for some reason. Now, this is a bit problematic, because even if it's actually a fairly obviously bad idea, once you have a sufficiently big group, you're going to have real trouble keeping yourself from doing it. So one heuristic is, when you find yourself in a situation like that, you should generally try to be more conservative than you think is rational, given what you normally would believe if you were alone. If you find yourself in a unilateralist curse situation, you should play things safer. You don't want to be the spoiler. Now, if panspermia was very unlikely to work, then this goes away, actually. Somebody is the guy and launches a space probe, but the probability of it having an effect is very small. If the probability gets higher, then we get a sharper situation and need to be much more cautious. And we don't even know when that point happens. And that is a bit of a scare. So the interesting issue here is that uncertainty might actually force us to be more conservative. Now, as we described in that unilateralist paper, the best solution is to create institutions. Trying to, on your own, act in a rational way here is hard. You can do it, but you need to run Bayesian calculations in your head, and that's hard for most heads. But you sharing information, working together, creating a rule for what is allowed and not allowed, that is kind of doable, and we're actually pretty good at doing it. We can actually develop consensus of various kinds. One could also think about another interesting thing, and that is, even if we don't want to do it right now, we might still want to do something in the case we really flub it up. So instead of a dead man switch, we might want to have a life hand switch. In the case of the Earth going totally to hell in a handbasket, press the red button and launch the spores. And I hope that the next one might work. That is something one can set up, advocate safeguards to, etc., and might actually be a very good idea to do, and might also keep the panspermia enthusiasts busy actually designing that system without trying to launch it illicitly. I'm running out of time, so I don't have the time to talk too much about the even grander things about spreading on even grander scales, and the balance between the X risk and the suffering risks. I'm writing another paper with Bruce Tsai, where we're having this fun conclusion that according to at least one theory, we should settle just exactly 6 planets across the reachable universe. But there are many more things, like maybe life is the wrong thing to send. Maybe we ought to be sending machines. Maybe we ought to solve suffering. Because delaying the panspermia right now is kind of cheap and easy to do. There are few people who seriously try to do it. Midterm, developing a good consensus on how to handle a cosmic footprint is going to be important. It's going to take time. And long term, yeah, we probably should fix suffering. I think that sounds like a pretty good long-term goal. But that is in the future. Now I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anders, for your lovely talk. We can take a seat and answer some questions. So on top card for this event, you should see a live discussion option. So please type in your questions in there. I'll try and prioritize the questions with the most upvotes. So if you see a good question on there, upvote it. I see we already have a question, so we can just begin. Let's see. Okay, so we have a question from Peter here. It's kind of a 3-part question. Is there some ethical approach that is more useful than others for morally evaluating greening the universe? You've tended to speak about rights and duties. To what extent is that an intentional and considered choice? And could you comment on the applicability of utilitarianism or virtue ethics in such classes?
Wow, that's a wonderful 3-part question. It's enough to make a pretty good lecture. Speaking about rights and duties because of intention, I'm not good at intention. I'm just doing stuff randomly. I'm very much a stochastic parrot. But of course, from an ethics standpoint, different ethical systems lend themselves to different kinds of questions. I love virtue ethics for thinking about my personal life. It's very good for thinking about, I should try to be a more courageous person. I should try to handle those impulses that make me procrastinate better. But that doesn't scale very well to society. I'm writing a paper about civilizational virtues, and I do think they in some sense can exist. But it's much harder to run virtue ethics in a collective fashion. We might say, we want to have a virtuous space program, but that's very hard to fly. Saying we want a utilitarian space program, we can totally do that. We might quibble a lot about the details, but it's much easier to implement. Similarly, a Kantian deontological perspective also lends itself to collective action much more. So I think, sadly, virtue ethics is going to be having to take a back seat, which is always complaining about, and many virtue ethicists are trying to find better ways of dealing with it. Generally, I think recognizing normative uncertainty is important here. We actually don't have a complete theory about what good is. We don't have a complete theory about what's moral. It's not just that we disagree with each other. Even if you are an honest person and are trying to understand everybody's position, it's kind of hard to tell what we ought to be doing here. There are good arguments everywhere. Some of them lead to weird conclusions. We are confused. At that point, of course, we should recognize that we should try to act in a way that is robust in regards to that confusion. So I think there are techniques from normative uncertainty in the thinking that can help us here. We might want to actually try to get different views together, try to have a kind of moral parliament and see, okay, what is it that every view more or less agrees on? That is something we can actually go with. What is it that we have firm disagreement on? Can we find out information that makes us resolve that disagreement one way or another? So that's probably my recipe for these things, but I don't think I covered all of that question, but well, let's take the next one.
Yeah, so we have a question here. Would the idea / discovery that we were a product of a previous civilization using panspermia change your ideas about our own obligation to doing the same?
That is an interesting one. If we discovered that we were the result of a natural panspermia, that, okay, there is various little seeds floating around and life didn't originate on Earth, but is part of this big tapestry of cosmological evolution, I think most people would say, whoa, that's cool. We're going to do some nature documentaries with David Attenborough narrating about this. But it's not too unsettling. On the other hand, if we found that, oh, there are some precursors, they actually seeded Earth, although not for us. They seeded Earth with some prokaryotes literally billions of years ago, and either very, very gone, or maybe now there's something very weird post-alien. That is a bit more unsettling. I think most people wouldn't be too changed by it. But I think intellectually what it means is we are part of a bigger community here. And it's a community in the sense that now there are actually beings and intentions involved, not just that evolution is blindly stumbling around and occasionally doing marvelous things. But now there are intentions around in the universe. We have a place, we have literally a kind of parent civilization, even if we never get to know them. And that might be interesting and important. It might also make us think, oh, maybe we now have a duty to continue this. And some people will say, wait a minute, we can totally rebel about those guys. They thought it was a good idea. I don't think so. I think we can totally do something different. It would change the debate quite a lot, and it would probably force us to recognize a much bigger reality outside Earth. Most of the time, we tend to be kind of obsessed just by the big things we have on Earth. It's kind of unfathomable how large the biosphere is and how old our history is. But in this case, we would be forced to think on a truly Stapledonian sense. His Last and First Men and Star Maker are some of the greatest science fiction novels of all time, just because we take this vast sweep of human and intelligent history across the universe. And I think it would be good for us to think like that.
Nice. And then we have time for another question. What do you mean by phenomenological engineering?
Yes. So part of Metzinger's description of suffering is that one of the requirements is, of course, that you have a phenomenology. There is something like being you. And robots that don't have any internal experience can't suffer. There is an interesting question whether they can still be a moral patient and we still might have to care for them. But clearly, if pain is just a number, instead of something that is actually experienced as qualia, there might be an important difference. And indeed, Metzinger had been a bit worried that our work in AI might create phenomenological experience in machines that we don't recognize and that we create tremendous moral harms by just blindly stumbling into a world of AI. And he was also very upset when he noted that most AI ethicists totally ignored the question. They might disagree with him, but just ignoring this question is kind of disturbing. But suppose it's true that you can get phenomenology through certain configurations of matter or software and energy. In that case, you can probably engineer it. Certainly you can engineer your phenomenology by taking some weird drugs. That's not much engineering, of course. It's more like standard kind of, a little bit of witchcraft. We know a few things, we can put stuff together. But we could imagine turning this into a science and an engineering. Like, okay, for this purpose, I want to get rid of pain. Indeed, we're doing that with normal painkillers. We're decently good at it. We ought to become much better because there's too much unnecessary suffering in the world. But we could imagine also trying to create organisms that don't have negative experiences. Some people would say that's not possible. If you have good experiences, there must be a contrast, etc. There is a big debate to be had about that. I disagree. I think actually suffering and pleasure are orthogonal angles in our phenomenological space. But then again, I'm not a philosopher of mind. I might be utterly wrong about this. But it wouldn't surprise me that once we know enough, we might actually find ways of engineering phenomenology. And that could allow us to create interesting things. I don't know whether we could engineer life that would naturally evolve on a remote planet without any human oversight into beings that don't suffer. That is, in my opinion, unlikely. I think evolution will rather strongly create suffering-like systems. But then again, I would imagine that I could send robots and self-replicating robots with some code, and if they have a phenomenology and we did it right, we could prevent them from evolving. Because now we could put in rules for how they evolve and mutate that leave certain things invariant. And maybe we can do the same thing with life. But this is rather advanced stuff that I don't think we have a good handle on yet. We should get it, though.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I think that's all the questions we had time for today. So I'd just like to say, everyone give Anders a big round of applause.